head. The directors discussed going back to the management group on the question of a reset one final time. Rinaldini called Jim Stern. One last time, would the management group consider installing a reset? Stern refused. Finally, it was time to deal with Kravis. Even before hearing Shearson's answer, Atkins and company had resolved to give Kravis the same chance to make a final bid they had given Nussbaum 6 hours earlier. Around the table, the drawn and gaunt directors hoped Kravis would make this easier for them. As Atkins led a procession out of the room, John Medlin had a final word for him. "Tell them," he said, "we need another $1 of cash to tilt it in their direction." As Atkins and his group entered the corner office, Kravis sat on a rattan sofa, tired, poker-faced, right hand propping up his head. Roberts sat beside him, lips stretched tight across his face. Above the cousins' heads hung a giant blue marlin, the trophy of some lawyer's summer vacation. Rather and 3 Kohlberg-Kravis associates, flanked by Beatty and Kogut, lined the walls. An aquarium filled with multicolored fish burbled to one side. The board, Atkins said, was willing to give Kohlberg-Kravis one final opportunity to bid. If you haven't already done so, this is the time to put in your best bid. Silence. Kravis and Roberts were too startled to speak. Beatty and Kogut exchanged a glance of amazement. One final bid? Hadn't they been through this 5 hours ago? Felix Rohatyn's voice filled the void. "This is a serious offer. You should do your best to respond to it." Then, looking Kravis square in the eye, Rohatyn said, "We want your highest and last offer." "This is the craziest thing we've ever seen," Kravis said. "We gave it to you 5 hours ago." A half hour later, Beatty and Kogut emerged from the aquarium room and sought out Atkins. They found him leaning against a wall outside the boardroom. Kohlberg-Kravis has 2 conditions before it will place its final bid on the table, Beatty said. First, a merger agreement must be drawn up and submitted to directors as part of the offer. "Because we want this to end," Beatty explained. Second, and most important, Kravis and Roberts wanted the board's promise that if they bid, neither Johnson nor any member of management would be allowed into the final board meeting. "We're not going to give you another offer if it's going to be reviewed by a board that includes Johnson or anyone in management," Beatty said. "Why not?" Atkins asked. "Peter, for obvious reasons. Ross'll just stand up and bid again." Kogut chimed in. "If we say X, he'll just say X plus 1. He's always got the last bid." Atkins had to admit they had a point. This was something he hadn't thought of. Assuring the 2 lawyers he would get back to them, Atkins walked off to find some help. 5 minutes later, Atkins closeted himself in an empty office with Mike Mitchell and Dennis Block. The trio was among the most experienced on Wall Street. But this one had them stumped. How do you uninvite a chief executive to his own board meeting? "It's clear to me you can't just exclude him," Block said. "What do we do?" Law books were pulled down from shelves and thumbed through, but an answer evaded them. Johnson seemed to have every right to attend the meeting. Holding the meeting without him invited a lawsuit. "There's no way we can keep him out," Mitchell said. The minutes ticked by. Could he be fired? Too messy, they decided. Atkins was growing desperate. The fate of the entire $25 billion deal hung in the balance. Then, suddenly, Mitchell asked the obvious question. Why don't we ask them if they plan to attend? It was so simple. Maybe Johnson wouldn't want to come. Atkins found Goldstone in a hallway. Giving no hint of why he was asking, the Skadden lawyer explained that the board was set to meet and choose a victor. "Will your people be there?" he asked in an offhand manner. "Wait a second," Goldstone said. "We'll check." Goldstone returned minutes later with a question. "Will KKR be at the meeting?" he asked. "No." "Well then, no, we don't plan to be there unless KKR will be." Atkins heaved an inner sigh of relief. Unwittingly, Goldstone had just laid the groundwork for Kravis to boost his bid one final time. No one bothered to ask Johnson whether he wanted to attend his final board meeting. By then, Johnson and his aides were into their first round of drinks several blocks away. Dick Beatty and Felix Roeden, both active in New York political circles, leaned against a wall outside the boardroom and discussed ways to improve city schools as they waited for Atkins. Finally, Atkins returned and stated, "We can assure you management will not be in the meeting." Beatty pushed off from the wall and headed for the aquarium room, where Kravis waited. Kravis went around the room one last time. What should we bid? This time, the debate was tense. Every man in the room knew the fate of the deal, and possibly their entire industry, was on the line. 50 cents a share too much or too little could be the difference. Already the bidding had reached heights all but the foolhardy were uncomfortable with. More than once that day, Kravis and Roberts had talked about walking away from this deal. One wrong move could be fatal. Scott Stewart sat on the couch beside Roberts, thumbing through a sheaf of computer runs, answering questions as Kravis went around the room. "Let's just go home," Stewart said. "We're being jacked around here." Paul Rather wanted to stay, but could see no reason to raise their bid. "This is just bullshit," he said. "I think we ought to tell them that's all there is." Around and around the room they went, and when they stopped, no one was surprised to find they were boosting their bid again. The verdict seemed unanimous. They would throw in one last raise, just 50 cents a share in cash, roughly $115 million. "Is everybody comfortable with that?" Roberts asked. All around, heads bobbed. Then, "No, I'm not." The voice was Jamie Green's. For the second time in 2 days, the young San Francisco associate would be responsible for initiating a shift in strategy. "I don't know if we should do it at all," Green said. "But if we do, let's do it with $1 in cash. We've come this far. We want to win this deal." "I think he's right," Roberts said. "That's exactly what we should do. We've gone this far. We've made up our minds we want to own this company. Let's not get short-sighted now." Kravis agreed. Green's last raise was swiftly approved. The last issue was a deadline. Once before, Kravis's group had forgotten it, allowing the process to drag on another 6 hours. They wouldn't forget it this time. Someone suggested a half hour. Roberts voted for 15 minutes. "Nah, George," Beatty said. "You can't do anything in 15 minutes. 30 minutes it was. Beatty summoned Atkins and Roeten to hear the final bid. Kravis, sitting on the couch, spoke first. "You'll now hear our final bid, and Cliff will read it to you." He motioned to Robbins, who sat in a chair beside the aquarium. The young associate read out the new bid. Then he handed Atkins a merger agreement signed by both Roberts and Kravis. If the bid was accepted, Atkins was to return the agreement with Hugel's signature. "We want it back signed in 30 minutes, Roberts said. Kravis nodded. "We're leaving in a half hour." His face blank, Atkins retreated, followed by Roeden. It was 8:15. The fuse had been lit. 3 floors below, Steve Goldstone was famished. He hadn't eaten all day. He decided to wait out the committee at a Chinese restaurant just across Lexington Avenue. As he left, Goldstone turned to Jack Nussbaum. "What do you think?" he said. "KKR?" Nussbaum nodded. The last bid in hand, Roeden and the investment bankers huddled in a corner of the boardroom. To the untrained eye, Johnson's group was the clear winner, $112 versus $109. But things are rarely that simple on Wall Street. Cohen and Gutfriend's refusal to include a reset mechanism meant their bid had to be discounted. Minutes later, Roeten addressed the board. "Both bids," he announced, "are between 108 and 109. When you get that close, And when you're dealing with securities in amounts that have never been dealt with before, in my business judgment, these offers are essentially equivalent. They are both fair from a financial point of view. They are close enough that we can't tell you one is clearly superior to the other. A dead heat. It was the last thing the directors wanted to hear. Now they would have to make a decision. In their hearts, every person in the room knew how the board felt. The problem was finding a legally defensible reason to feel that way. To help the board make its decision, Rohatyn pointed out a half-dozen differences between the two bids. As the directors had long requested, Kravis had promised to leave 25% of the stock in shareholders' hands. Shearson, despite repeated emphasis by the board's bankers, opted for just 15%. Kravis promised to sell only a portion of Nabisco. Shearson would sell it all. Shearson's failure to guarantee its securities via a reset was mentioned. So too was the management group's inflexibility on guaranteeing employee benefits, such as relocation expenses. Cohen wanted these matters to be negotiable with the ultimate buyers of RJR Nabisco businesses. Like some financial smorgasbord, each board member now seized on one of the differences to justify his selection. John Medlin chose the reset. Shearson's best efforts promise isn't good enough, Medlin said. You don't do that in a $25 billion deal. We've got to know where those securities will trade. Nods all around. Al Butler thought of his friends holding stock in Winston-Salem and seized on the stock disparity. Juanita Krebs cited Kravis's promises to treat employees more fairly. Bill Anderson liked that one too. Can I assume that KKR will look after employees better? He asked. More nods. Security guards had finally released Kravis's clamoring investment bankers from the reception area where they had been held all day. The cream of Wall Street's merger society, including Gleacher, Wasserstein, and Beck, had passed the time cracking jokes and passing rumors. Now, let through the dike, the bankers clustered around the entrance to the corner room where the Kohlberg-Kravis contingent waited. Casey Kogut once more closed the door in their faces. As they waited for the board's verdict, Kravis and Roberts decided to blunt the crackling tension with a prank. Everyone inside the room picked up his coat and computer runs and, without saying a word, got up and walked out the door, past the bankers, and down the hall, as if to leave. The bankers didn't believe it for a second. No one was crazy enough to leave now. The half hour was nearly up. Felix Rohatyn left the boardroom and hustled down to where Kravis and Roberts waited. We need another 10 minutes, he said. Oh, come on, Roberts said. We're not going to do this. Just bear with us, Rohatyn said. At this point, it's clearly in your best interest to stay around. Is this really 10 minutes? Kravis asked. Yes. Fine, Kravis said. You've got it. He wasn't going to lose a $25 billion deal over 10 minutes. 5 minutes later, discussion inside the boardroom ebbed. Time is running out, Hugel said. Call for a motion. Marty Davis spoke first. I move we award to KKR. Second, said John McEmer. All in favor? Hugel said. Hands filled the air. All opposed? No hands. The vote, Hugel said, is unanimous. Atkins led a cluster of board advisors to the Kravis contingent. In his hands was a copy of the merger agreement. His face betraying no emotion, Atkins opened the agreement and pointed out a tiny clause that needed approval. Dick, what is this? Kravis said, unsure what Atkins was up to. Beatty leaned over and inspected the change. It had to do with severance provisions for RJR Nabisco executives. Yeah, he said. We'll agree to that. Atkins closed the contract and handed it to Kravis. Here's your signed contract, the lawyer intoned. Congratulations. It's yours. Kravis went numb. He had been fighting for this so long. He had lost 8 pounds in the last 6 weeks. He took the agreement from Atkins and said, "Great." Roberts said little. All he could think of was how much work was ahead. There were congratulations all around. After a minute, Kravis turned to Cliff Robbins. "Get all the bankers into a conference room and stay with them," he said, "and don't let any of them use the phones, especially Wasserstein." Atkins next led his procession 3 flights down to the Shearson group. When they reached the conference room where Nussbaum, Stern, and the others waited, only Atkins went in. Steve Goldstone was called at the Chinese restaurant and put on a speakerphone. Goldstone's stomach was in knots as he took the phone. Atkins's tone was funereal. "Steve, this is Peter." "Hi. I'm sorry to report the board has signed a merger agreement with KKR. The bids were dead even, but the board decided to sign with KKR for other reasons." Goldstone went numb. "What were those other reasons, if you can tell me?" he asked mechanically. Atkins explained that all the facts would be contained in an SEC filing in the next few days. Then he shrugged his shoulders and walked out. At Scarlatti, Johnson took Goldstone's call at the Mater D's station. "Hey, Ross," the lawyer said. "Guess what?" The tone of his voice told Johnson everything. "Surprise," Johnson said. His bemusement was gone. He was very tired. "KKR got the bid." "Fine," Johnson said after a moment. "Let's get together at 9 West and see the guys." Johnson returned to the table a moment later and broke the news. "I don't much feel like eating," he said. "Let's go back and see the troops." Amid the backslapping and congratulations, Charlie Hugel collared Kravis and guided him into an empty office. "Congratulations. It's a great company you're buying," he said. "You know, you only made one mistake." "What was that?" Kravis asked. "Paul Stick. Just be careful about that. That got a lot of people on the board upset. You've got to understand there's a history there." Kravis nodded. "Go slow now," Hugel said. "You've got good people down there. I'll help you in any way I can during the transition." Afterward, Hugel, his gouted foot throbbing, limped down to the lobby, where a security guard tried to sneak him out a back door to avoid the television cameras milling about outside. Hugel barely made it to his car when the crowd spotted him and ran up. Seeing their approach, the security guard slammed shut the car door, right on Hugel's foot. It hurt so bad he wanted to scream. A fitting conclusion, he would acknowledge, to a painful process. When the camera crews chased after Hugel, Kravis and Roberts slipped unnoticed out the front door and spent the evening celebrating at Il Nido, a nearby Italian restaurant. Carol and Rome sat by the phone at their Park Avenue apartment all night, waiting for the word. At 10:36, she would never forget the minute, it finally rang. "We got it," Kravis said. Rome let out a whoop of joy. "Yeah!" Johnson was gracious in defeat. Arriving at 9 West, the first thing he did was open the bar. Then, scotch in hand, he took time to talk with each of his executives, clapping them on the back and congratulating them for fighting the good fight. "We're now going to go the high road," Johnson told Jim Robinson, who showed up with his wife and Steve Goldstone. "These people have got new owners. We don't want a lot of acrimony being created. The game is over. We've played it into overtime. Whether they gave you an elbow in the eye or crack-blocked your butt end, it doesn't matter. That's the score. Let's get on with our lives." Not everyone took defeat as well. As the evening wore on, Ed Horrigan grew bitter and morose. Unlike Johnson, who had bounced from job to job in a long career, Horrigan was a long-time Reynolds man. He was used to being the big wheel in Winston-Salem. Despite Johnson's warnings, he had never really believed they could lose. "We got the goddamn shaft," he complained to Johnson. Ed, you know we've been getting it for a long time, Johnson said. Shit, I've been the lightning rod. But we've got to get on. We've got to get back, get the businesses in shape. He went on. You watch. There'll be a big social change. It'll be fine for a while. Then people will be surging over to the new owners. You know, the king is dead, long live the king. Horrigan only grew angrier. At one point, Johnson was forced to intervene in a nasty confrontation between Horrigan and John Martin in a hallway. Searching for scapegoats, Horrigan was railing about Martin's handling of the press. "You're the most ineffective, immature son of a bitch that ever walked the face of the earth," Horrigan shouted. "Ed," Martin responded, "you come to your conclusions, and I'll come to mine." Johnson, fearing the two men might come to blows, swiftly broke them up. "Gentlemen, this is no time for this. We've been a great team. We've done a good job. If anything went wrong, it was me." Horrigan and Martin were glaring at each other. "Come on now," Johnson said. "Shake hands." "I'm not going to shake his fucking hand," Horrigan sputtered. Well after midnight, everyone had left except Goldstone, the Robinsons, and Ross and Laurie Johnson. The five of them sat around the table in the fishbowl conference room. Linda was helping Johnson with a press release to be issued the next morning. Goldstone could tell Johnson was starting to wind down. "You remember that time we talked about the price of doing something like this?" Johnson asked the attorney. Goldstone smiled. He thought about that day on the porch, long ago it seemed, watching the red Florida sun sink. Johnson laughed. "It surely was painful, just like you said. But I'll tell you the same thing I told you then. I don't know what else I would have done. It was the best thing for shareholders. It was the right thing to do." Johnson's driver, Frank Mancini, was up on the floor, waiting for the group to break up. Johnson rose from the table and said, "Let's go home." Epilogue. On the morning after, Ross Johnson boarded a plane for Atlanta. Before leaving, he dictated a press release that, among other things, noted the best bid had won. When Linda Robinson ran a copy by Peter Cohen, Cohen grew incensed. He fired off a call to Steve Goldstone. "If this goes out, we're dead," Cohen said. "This release will kill us." For an instant, Goldstone was confused. He thought they were dead. The bidding was over. Goldstone hung up and called Johnson aboard the plane racing south. Johnson was irked. For the first time in 6 weeks, he decided to put his foot down. In minutes, he was on the phone to Cohen. "It's over, Peter," Johnson said. "I've had it. What point are we serving now? We're not serving the company or the shareholders. It's over." Still, Cohen, Hill, and the other Shearson dealmakers spent days thrashing out ways to get back at Kravis. A lawsuit was considered. In the end, of course, they did nothing. 5 days after Kravis was crowned the winner, Shearson Lehman Hutton issued a press statement officially closing the battle for RJR Nabisco. Wednesday night, Jim Maher was thinking about heading home early when Kim Fennebresk came bounding into his office. "John Grinnis is in town," Fennebresk said, "and he wants to talk to us." The Nabisco executive was in a downstairs conference room, the banker said. Maher canceled a meeting and walked downstairs with Fennebresk, who led his boss into the room. "Surprise!" Maher was speechless. He had almost forgotten Wednesday was his birthday. The room was filled with balloons and cake and champagne and friends. Fennebresk gave a toast. "I never pass up the opportunity to toast the boss in December," he said, alluding to Wall Street's January bonuses. "On behalf of everyone who worked so hard in the last 2 weeks, we very much appreciate your inspirational leadership." Its RJR Nabisco experience proved a boon for Maher's troops. Despite the doomsayers, First Boston completed more mergers than any other Wall Street firm during the first 6 months of 1989. Its work with Jay Pritzker paid off in a number of Pritzker-related assignments, culminating in the joint First Boston Pritzker purchase of American Medical International for $1.6 billion in 1989. In September 1990, Maher was named vice chairman of First Boston. The morning after winning the greatest victory of his career, Kravis flew to Florida for his mother's 80th birthday. The next day, he hopped north to Atlanta to inspect his new prize. Johnson, upright in defeat, was waiting for him at the airport. "Well," Johnson said, "congratulations to you, pal. You've got a hell of a company here." Johnson drove them in his Mercedes to the Galleria, where he gave a tour of the headquarters and offered to turn over his office to Kravis on the spot. "I'm here for you to do anything you want," Johnson said. "The planes are yours. It's your company." Ross, go slow," Kravis said, reminding him the company wouldn't change hands for months yet. "You just keep running the company as you have in the past." That afternoon, Kravis flew to Winston-Salem and met with Ed Horrigan. Horrigan was every bit as gracious as Johnson, although it was soon clear for different reasons. Kravis, like Johnson before him, needed Horrigan's tobacco expertise, and so, with Kravis's encouragement, Horrigan agreed to become a tentative member of the Kohlberg-Kravis team. A week later, Kravis took a call from Horrigan in New York. "I just want to tell you, I'm not going to be number 2 anymore," Horrigan said. "I have worked for 3 guys who are now history: Paul Stick, Tylee Wilson, and Ross Johnson. I either want to be CEO or I leave." Thus began an intricate pas de deux. As each major presentation to bank lenders approached, Horrigan would say he didn't feel right about appearing if he wasn't going to be CEO. He didn't want to mislead the bankers if he wasn't going to be with the company. Kravis would adroitly sidestep, promising to make clear that Horrigan's future was undecided. By the 3rd round, Kravis had had enough. "I don't think you should speak," he said. "Why don't you just quit?" In mid-February, Horrigan did. His resignation came with a sumptuous office in Winston-Salem with secretary, an option to buy his company apartment in New York and house outside Palm Beach, promptly exercised, and a golden parachute worth $45.7 million. Later, he used some of the proceeds to buy a candy company in Atlanta. At 8 a.m. on February 9, 1989, Kravis opened the floodgates for a torrent of money. That morning, Drexel Burnham Lambert delivered $5 billion worth of checks, the bridge loan it had promised. Kohlberg-Kravis transferred $2 billion from its own bank account to RJR Nabisco's. Manufacturers Hanover Trust Company gathered $11.9 billion from banks throughout the world and deposited the loaned money into an escrow account for Kohlberg-Kravis. It totaled $18.9 billion, the amount needed to pay the cash portion of the buyout. It was the biggest river of money ever to course through the U.S. financial system. The Federal Reserve Bank couldn't wire money in amounts over $1 billion, so the banks moved it around in increments of $800 million to $950 million. The flow was so big it made U.S. money supply statistics temporarily bulge as it roared through the system. A 30th floor conference room at Dick Beatty's firm, Simpson, Thacher & Bartlett, was packed with 200 lawyers and bankers, acting as a financial corps of engineers. They carefully monitored the river, seeing that tributaries entered and locks opened at the right times. By 10:45 a.m., it was over. The money had all changed hands, and so had the ownership of RJR Nabisco. Johnson officially resigned that day, pulling the cord on his $53 million golden parachute. His fanciest Gulfstream jet yet, ordered before the LBO battle, flew him to Jupiter on its maiden voyage. Johnson released a final statement before leaving. "The process we commenced last October has benefited the company's shareholders and has proven the financial strength of our varied businesses." Yet in the world's greatest concentration of RJR shareholders, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, they weren't thanking Johnson, even as the money gushed into town. No sooner had Kravis won than signs began popping up. Goodbye, Ross. Hello, KKR. Nearly $2 billion of checks arrived there in the late February mail. Now, more than ever, Winston-Salem was the city of reluctant millionaires. The river of money had washed away the last of RJR's stock. Local brokers and bankers who managed people's money got calls from distraught clients. "I won't sell my stock," more than one sobbed. "Daddy said don't ever sell the RJR stock." They were patiently told they had to. They were told the world had changed. No sooner had the checks arrived than out-of-town financial consultants descended on Winston-Salem to advise its residents on how best to spend their new riches. In leaflets tucked under windshields in the Reynolds parking lot, in pesky phone calls, in seminars at the Holiday Inn, stockbrokers offered to help people reinvest their windfall in the market. The frequent, incredulous response, "You want me to buy stock?" "You have to understand," said Nabby Armfield, Jr., a retired stockbroker, "Reynolds wasn't a stock. It was a religion." Mr. Armfield even recorded a song to express the community's frustrations that became an underground hit. Sung to the tune of Frosty the Snowman, the chorus went, "F. Rossi the Snowman had a triple comma dream. You can have the skim milk and I'll make do with cream. Hey, all you bucolics, here's a deal that's really sweet. You take title to the chaff, and I'll haul off the wheat." In December, Johnson sent each director a dozen roses with a note. "Congratulations on a great job. The shareholders won." He had one more dinner with them before his last board meeting in December, where everyone made polite conversation, but made no amends. John McEmer was in an avenging spirit, advancing the idea of scrapping the management team's 1988 bonuses. Bob Shaberly was practically in tears as he talked about the breakup of Nabisco. Marty Davis squelched the idea of paying each special committee member a $250,000 fee. The Winston-Salem directors took the brunt of public criticism there. A high society matron was seen elaborately crossing the names of John Medlin and Albert Butler from her Christmas party list. A tobacco employee walked up to Medlin one day and declared, "I wish I had $1 million in your bank so I could take it out and really hurt you." For the other directors, life went on, rather more pleasantly. USA Today named Charlie Hugel one of its business heroes of 1988. His combustion engineering company was bought by a Swedish company the following year, and Hugel accepted a familiar title under the new ownership, non-executive chairman. John McEmer was named chairman of the U.S. Export-Import Bank. Vernon Jordan went on RJR's reconstituted board, joining Medlin as a holdover. Paul Stick swung into his third term as chairman of RJR, and wasted no time causing a commotion by announcing, incorrectly, that headquarters would return to Winston-Salem. Once again, he flew around the country in his beloved corporate jets and settled into his old office in the Glass Menagerie. He was pleased to see the end of Ross Johnson, but, he admitted, the price was horrible. "I feel bad," he told a visitor a few days after his return. "I wish it had never happened." Stick, of course, was a figurehead as RJR's interim chief executive. Kravis surrounded him with an operating committee of partners and trusted RJR executives to keep him from any mischief. Kravis also stepped up his search for a permanent chief executive. At the same time, on Thursday evening, March 9th, Jim Robinson got a call at his apartment from his longtime number 2, Louis Gerstner, a dynamic executive whose signature adorned the American Express traveler's check. "I have to see you in the morning," Gerstner said. Robinson pleaded that his schedule was crowded. Gerstner said it was urgent. They agreed to meet at the Robinsons' apartment soon after dawn the next day. There, Gerstner dropped a bomb. He was to be the next chief executive of RJR Nabisco. Later that morning, a startled Robinson was riding in his limousine when he took a call from Kravis. The buyout king apologized for luring away Gerstner and said he hoped it wouldn't cause American Express too much trouble. Jim Robinson was nothing if not diplomatic. "Henry, I want to compliment you on your judgment," he said. "You only made one mistake. You didn't offer it to me first." Both men laughed, but the sting was undeniable. Wall Street is a small place, and in the interests of harmony, Kravis wasted no time healing wounds inflicted during the fight. He made peace with Peter Cohen at a summit in February and actually hired Tom Hill to investigate the possible takeover of Northwest Airlines. Relations between Kravis and Tom Strauss remained strained. Shortly after the deal closed, the Strausses moved into a new Park Avenue apartment directly below the Kravises. When the Solomon executive had some remodeling done, a crack appeared in the wall of Kravis's apartment. Kravis also moved to smooth relations with Linda Robinson. Soon after the Gerstner episode, Linda took a message that Kravis had called. She ignored it. Within days, she received a small ceramic doghouse with a cute note from Kravis, suggesting he was in the Robinsons' doghouse. Linda Robinson waited a few days, then sent Kravis a 20-pound bag of dog food. All was forgiven. She and Kravis still own Trillion. Fees, of course, went infinitely further toward soothing Wall Street's wounds. In the coming months, it rained money at the firms lucky enough to be on the winning side in the RJR Nabisco fight. Drexel Burnham reaped $227 million in fees from a $3.5 billion bridge loan. It got even more from selling junk bonds. Merrill Lynch got $109 million for its role in the bridge financing. A syndicate of 200 banks collected $325 million for committing $14.5 billion of loans. Kohlberg Kravis itself collected $75 million in fees from its investors. Morgan Stanley and Wasserstein Perella got $25 million apiece. Kravis even spread the largesse to those whose feelings he might have bruised. Jeff Boisie's Goldman Sachs got the job of auctioning Del Monte, while Felix Rohatyn's Lazard Frères did the same for the company's stake in ESPN. The closing dinner Kravis threw to commemorate the deal will long be remembered. Held in the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom, 400 investment bankers, lawyers, and other friends of the firm feasted on lobster, followed by veal with morel sauce and a 3-foot-high cake decorated with edible replicas of Nabisco products, all washed down with Dom Perignon. "It's wonderful to see all these friends of KKR here tonight," Dick Beatty opened the evening. "To think it only took $1 billion in fees to get us all together." Beatty was in rare form, roasting enemy and friend alike. "I see Jeff Beck over there," the lawyer noted. "Jeff, I want to remind you that this dinner is off the record." Amid gales of laughter, Beck's voice echoed through the hall. "Talk to Wasserstein! Talk to Wasserstein!" RJR Nabisco may have been the Mad Dog's last hurrah. In January 1990, the Wall Street Journal printed a lengthy article suggesting that much of Beck's colorful background was fictitious. For years, stories of the investment banker's days as a decorated Vietnam jungle fighter and heir to $1 billion fortune had been repeated as fact. Some of these anecdotes made it as far as early unpublished versions of this book. But during the fact-checking process, Beck's tales couldn't be corroborated, and so were dropped from the finished manuscript. That discovery led to the Journal article. After its publication, Mr. Beck resigned from Drexel. In the months after his victory, Kravis shone. At parties, Nouvelle societies, adoring courtiers cheered, "Make way for King Henry." In May, he and Rome and a group of friends toured India, dining with Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and the Maharaja of Jaipur. Kravis and Rome wore thick leis of jasmine, tuberose, and roses, and were honored guests at an elephant festival where the beasts paraded in gold and multi-hued costumes. They slipped down a river by barge, were serenaded with sitars, and ate feasts cooked over open fires. At the Maharaja's, fans blew cold air off blocks of ice topped by jasmine. "My goodness," said Oscar de la Renta, "if this is not refinement, what is?" Life, as they say, was good. But Kravis's victory tour proved short-lived. In August, his simmering dispute with Jerry Kohlberg burst into the open when Kohlberg sued Kohlberg-Kravis, claiming he had been cheated out of the proceeds from several LBO investments. The suit was settled in early 1990. Terms weren't disclosed. Soon after Kohlberg's suit, Kravis encountered his first publicized problems when he was forced to reschedule or miss debt payments on 3 LBOs, including Owens, Illinois. "Cracks in house that debt built," read the New York Times headline. Kravis insisted it was much ado about nothing and began focusing his attention on European targets. Yet a year after the fight for RJR broke out, Kravis had yet to initiate a new LBO. Competition remained stiff, and after his brush with publicity during RJR, Kravis was reluctant to enter heavily publicized fights like the Northwest Airlines fray. For the first time, newspapers and competitors began openly speculating if Kravis had lost his touch. At RJR, Lou Gerstner wasted no time whittling down Johnson's empire. With Dick Beatty at his side, Gerstner sold 7 out of 8 corporate jets, plus more than a dozen corporate apartments and homes. Only Johnson's prized hangar proved unsaleable. "It's just too grandiose," Beatty fretted in September 1989. "We can't give the thing away." McKinsey & Company consultants swarmed the Atlanta headquarters, evaluating everything and alienating many. Employees felt as though they were in an occupied land. For many, it was the final straw. When Kravis announced in April that headquarters would be moved to New York, only 10% of the managers offered jobs there agreed to go. "I don't feel like I work for a company anymore," said one refusenik. "I feel like I work for an investment." Just how good an investment it would prove remained unclear. The company reported a $1.15 billion net loss in 1989, after paying its $3.34 billion debt tab. It ran up a $330 million deficit in the first half of 1990. But its all-important cash flow was robust, and its divestitures of some food businesses reaped nearly $5 billion. The Del Monte canned foods operation was sold to a group which included Bob Carbonell. He became the new company's chairman. John Grinnes proved true to his word, improving Nabisco's operating profit by half and tripling its cash flow in 1989. The Dinah Shore LPGA budget was halved, PGA sponsorships were scuttled, and much of Team RJR Nabisco was given its unconditional release. And while Nabisco's gains proved hard to sustain, Grinnes became a Kravis favorite. He was named to RJR Nabisco's board. Reynolds Tobacco, however, was embattled. In March 1989, RJR killed Premier. In the next few months, it trimmed the payroll by 2,300 employees. In the course of the year, Philip Morris widened its lead ever further over RJR, taking advantage of the disarray. Attacks by health advocates grew fiercer. RJR had to scrap a new black-oriented cigarette called Uptown after Health and Human Services Secretary Louis W. Sullivan blasted the brand. Even Winston-Salem's neighboring city, Greensboro, joined the trend toward anti-smoking ordinances. Yet, the business still generated prodigious cash under its new chief executive, a 43-year-old New York banker named Jim Johnston. A one-time marketing whiz at Reynolds Tobacco, Johnston was fired in 1984 for opposing cigarette loading. He ended the practice upon his return, forcing $340 million in write-offs, but boosting factory and distribution efficiency. That change, together with deep cost-cutting, produced a 46% gain in operating profit for tobacco in the first half of 1990. 1990 brought the first serious challenge to RJR Nabisco's health, and ironically, it came from Wall Street. That all-important reset provision, forged in the final desperate hours of bidding, called for more than $4 billion of bonds to be restored to their original face value by April 1991. And as the date approached, the bonds were trading at a deep discount. The cost of a true reset could run into the billions, more than enough to break the company. Grasping for levity at a particularly black moment, George Roberts quipped that, without some form of immediate rescue, the sequel to Barbarians at the Gate might be called Huns on the Run. To its credit, Kohlberg Kravis wriggled out of its fix. In July 1990, it announced a $6.9 billion refinancing package, enabling it to buy back the junk bonds and substitute less onerous forms of debt. The costly maneuver probably assured that, as a buyout, RJR would neither be a free-fall disaster nor a windfall profit for Kohlberg Kravis. Whatever the case, it assured big paydays for the bankers and lawyers who reconfigured the original deal, another $250 million in fees. For Kravis, ultimate success, it was clear, was years away. To make matters worse, Philip Morris, sensing RJR's vulnerability, moved in for the kill, pummeling the company in a number of key markets. It expanded its sales force, undercut Reynolds on pricing, and attacked its strong discount brand, Doral, with 2 new off-price brands of its own. Analysts predicted RJR's cigarette volume could fall 7% to 8% in 1989, while Philip Morris gained volume. "Philip Morris is eating our lunch," Cliff Robbins of Kohlberg Kravis acknowledged in October 1989. "Marlboro is an unstoppable machine. We have a lot to do." By 1990, Wall Street's party was over, the memories of massive takeovers and buyouts receding more each day. In the wake of RJR Nabisco, LBO activity had dropped sharply, and by the fall of 1989, neither Kohlberg Kravis nor Forstmann Little had initiated a single major buyout. The prospect of anti-LBO legislation raised during RJR delayed many deals. What came to be known as the Ross Johnson factor nixed others. Few chief executives, after all, were willing to go through the public pillorying Johnson had endured. But what brought Wall Street to a grinding halt were tremors in the junk bond market. The first 8 months of 1989 saw $4 billion worth of junk bond defaults and debt moratoriums, the most spectacular being the troubles of Canadian entrepreneur Robert Campeau's U.S. retail empire. In October, the unraveling of a $6.79 billion buyout of United Airlines caused a panic on Wall Street, sending the Dow Jones Industrial Average down nearly 200 points and prompting fears of a new market crash. As Ted Forstmann had pointed out, junk bonds could be a useful tool if used correctly. The problem, of course, was that they had been abused and overused. In the months to come, the junk bond slump deepened, cutting off the fuel to Wall Street's takeover engine. When its banks put the squeeze on Drexel Burnham, already staggering from having paid $650 million in fines to settle its portion of the Milken case, the firm that symbolized the junk bond era filed for bankruptcy protection and announced its intention to liquidate. With Drexel's demise, and the guilty pleas of financial titans Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken in the insider trading scandals, popular opinion turned strongly against Wall Street and the unfettered greed of the 1980s. That backlash, combined with deteriorating financial fundamentals, effectively spelled the end to an era unlike any Wall Street has ever seen. A new wind was blowing. As the new decade dawned, the hottest specialty for young MBAs became financial restructuring, that is, fixing the broken takeovers of the 80s. Thousands of Wall Streeters, including a goodly number of under 30 millionaires, lost their jobs as finance skidded into what promised to be a years-long slump. The memoirs of a young Salomon Brothers bond salesman, Liar's Poker, which lampooned Wall Street's decade of excess, hit the bestseller list and stayed there for nearly a year. Everywhere, investment bankers and their merger brethren were attacked as something akin to low-grade war criminals. As a concept, takeovers were openly derided, even sometimes by those who made their fortunes on them. For the most part, the group's members emerged from the wreckage in good shape. In September 1990, Tom Hill was named co-chief executive of Shearson Lehman's investment banking unit. Eric Gleacher left Morgan Stanley to start his own boutique, Gleacher & Company, and quickly struck pay dirt, putting together ConAgra's $1.34 billion acquisition of Beatrice from Henry Kravis. Steve Waters was among two investment bankers to take the reins at Morgan after Gleacher's departure. Bruce Wasserstein suffered a barrage of media criticism for his roles in a number of disappointing deals. Among those who didn't survive the era's end was Peter Cohen, who agreed to resign as Shearson's chairman under pressure in January 1990. Relations between Cohen and Jim Robinson, already tense after the RJR Nabisco fight, deteriorated rapidly in 1989 as Shearson floundered through a number of setbacks, including a widely unpopular restructuring that led to the resignation of its president, Jeff Lane. On publication of this book, Cohen was surprised to learn details of Linda Robinson's secret role negotiating with Henry Kravis. The disclosure came at a sensitive moment for Cohen, who felt it undermined his authority and led to the final breach with the Robinsons. Afterward, he told a number of people that this book portrayed him unfairly and that Jim Robinson was party to every decision he made in the Nabisco deal, including negotiation of Ross Johnson's benefits package. Ted Forstmann, of course, felt thoroughly vindicated by the collapse of the junk bond era. He was the hero of a series of laudatory press clippings, the lonely voice in the dark who had triumphed over greed. His advisers told Forstmann to cool it, and to an extent he did. But the pull of righteousness was often too much, and Forstmann lapped up the attention, which of course he deserved. The final irony came in early 1990 when, as Henry Kravis scraped to keep RJR Nabisco together, Forstmann began doing deals again. Not many, just a deal here, a deal there, but it was more than anyone else in the LBO business managed. With junk bonds out of fashion, Forstmann's real money returned to the fore. For the first time in years, Ted Forstmann was the toast of the town. In Atlanta, Johnson took perverse pride in the slowdown. "I scared them all back into the closet," he said, giggling, in May 1989. 80 or 90% of companies had LBO studies. Now I have people telling me, "Jesus, Ross, we burned every file we had." Unlike others, Johnson neither brooded nor looked back. Jobless, he moved into offices in another building at the Galleria, where he shared a floor with a country music radio station. His new enterprise, a partnership with John Martin, was called RJM Associates. The two pals were always hard-pressed to say exactly what RJM Associates did, though it seemed to involve giving ad hoc advice to their friends for a $1-a-year fee. With an $18.2 million golden parachute of his own, Martin no more needed the income than Johnson. Johnson did invest with some old pals in a venture that bought Nabisco's Far East operations, but mostly he enjoyed himself. Between golf and ski vacations, Johnson puttered around with the 7 corporate boards he was on. He went to movies with Lori and continued the vigil for son Bruce, who emerged from his coma but remained in a trauma clinic, unable to speak. He has begun to communicate through spelling. "We're quite encouraged," Johnson said in the summer of 1990. Though Johnson professed to be delighted with the semi-retired life, friends doubted he would stay that way. For one thing, it wasn't in his nature to fly commercial. It might take a rehabilitation period for his reputation, friends said, but Ross Johnson would be back. In words that could be his epitaph, he didn't deny it. "I'm always available," he said, "for change." For all the upheaval, few in Winston-Salem blamed Kravis. Instead, it was Johnson they continued to vilify. Only a few took a broader view. If Ross Johnson hadn't existed, said Gene Hoots, RJR's former pension manager, it would have been necessary for Wall Street to invent him. In a sense, it had. Johnson was a product of his times, as surely as R.J. Reynolds was of his. The roaring 80s were a new Gilded Age, where winning was celebrated at all costs. The Casino Society, Felix Roeden once dubbed it. The investment bankers were part croupiers, part alchemists. They conjured up wild schemes, pounded out new and more outlandish computer runs to justify them, then twirled their temptations before executives in a devil dance. That, at any rate, is what Johnson took to calling it. Depending on one's viewpoint, the dance Johnson initiated at RJR will go down as either the high point or the low point of an era. It wasn't an accident that RJR Nabisco should provide that moment. In its final decade, Reynolds had become less a great company than a great dream machine. Its torrent of tobacco money allowed egos to run wild and fantasies to become true. Paul Stick could walk with kings. Ed Horrigan could live like kings. Directors could be treated like kings. Hoisted onto the auction block, the company became a vast prism through which scores of Wall Streeters beheld their reflected glories. Jim Maher could restore First Boston's greatness. Ted Forstmann could pursue his final jihad. Peter Cohen could go from administrator to merchant banking prince. Henry Kravis could have an empire's crowning touch. John Gutfriend could get the left side of the ultimate tombstone. The founders of both RJR and Nabisco would have utterly failed to understand what was going on here. It is not so hard, in the mind's eye, to see R.J. Reynolds and Adolphus Green wandering through the carnage of the LBO war. They would turn to one another, occasionally, to ask puzzled questions. Why did these people care so much about what came out of their computers, and so little about what came out of their factories? Why were they so intent on breaking up instead of building up? And last, what did this all have to do with doing business? Author's note. When we wrote Barbarians at the Gate in 1989, it was a book about current events. Now it's history. Some books age better than others. We'd like to think Barbarians has aged well. The book is still used in major business schools to teach any number of topics, from ethics to investment banking. In 1993, it was made into a movie on HBO. In 2002, 14 years after its heyday, the RJR fight was dramatized once again in a documentary film on the History Channel. This kind of reception was the furthest thing from our minds when we set out to write a book in 1989. Our primary goal, in fact, was simply to see whether we could actually write a book. Neither of us had ever tried it before. Nor was Barbarians exactly a prize publishing executives were fighting to handle. Of the half-dozen publishers we approached, in fact, precisely one, Harper & Row, now HarperCollins, had the slightest bit of interest. The newspapers had been saturated with the RJR story for weeks. Who wanted to read more? As reporters for the Wall Street Journal, we strived to imbue Barbarians with the standards of excellence and accuracy we learned at the paper. Indeed, Barbarians would not have been possible without the encouragement and the 8 months of unpaid leave that its editors, Norman Pearlstein and Paul Steiger, gave us. That October, when the RJR story broke, Brian was the Journal's reporter on the Wall Street mergers and acquisitions beat. Based in Atlanta, John covered the company itself. Together, we covered the twists and turns of the RJR fight for 6 long weeks. It was only when the struggle was over, and we agreed to write a book, that we actually met each other. John held up the infamous Time magazine cover of Ross Johnson so that Brian could identify him at the Atlanta airport. We're often embarrassed to admit the research and writing of Barbarians occurred in 8 short months, from January to August 1989. It was a manic period. From an unair-conditioned apartment in the Park Slope section of Brooklyn, Brian rode the subway into Manhattan to hold as many as 6 interviews a day. We believed strongly that all interviews should be done in person. At night, he would return to collate and write up his interview notes, sometimes donning swim trunks and a t-shirt in the summer heat. John had more traveling to do, shuttling between Atlanta, North Carolina, and New York to assemble the story of Ross Johnson's ascent. We worked separately, except for the crucial interviews with Johnson himself, informal marathon sessions held in Atlanta and Manhattan over pizza and soft drinks. As we worked on the book, we worried that RJR would be eclipsed by some even bigger and wilder deal. Between corporate raiders, LBO artists, and junk bond financiers, the whole 1980s business world had gone mad. The Barbarians' next assault could reduce RJR from epic to footnote. That's why Harper wanted the book so fast. We braced for that black day, which never came. The battle for RJR, it turned out, both defined and ended an era. KKR's winning bid of $25 billion stood for nearly a decade as the biggest business deal of all time. Several factors combined to tamp down the size of deals for several years. The great money machine behind LBOs, junk bonds, sputtered and, for a time, virtually stopped. Mike Milken went to jail. Drexel Burnham went bankrupt, and, in the early 90s recession, battered, over-leveraged companies gave leverage a bad name. Henry Kravis ceased stalking big game, preoccupied with the care and feeding and debt service of RJR. Other stars of 1980s Wall Street and combatants for RJR also overdosed on hubris and faded. John Gutfriend was ousted as chairman of Salomon Brothers in 1991 after a Treasury's trading scandal. His president, Tom Strauss, also resigned and joined Peter Cohen in obscurity at a hedge fund. Others became boutique bit players too, including Tom Hill at Blackstone Group and Steve Waters at a European private equity fund called Compass Partners. About the only Barbarians figure whose star rose was Steve Goldstone. The one-time attorney to Ross Johnson eventually became CEO of RJR Nabisco. But even Goldstone's job amounted to presiding mainly over the demise of the once mighty company. In 1999, he sold Nabisco to Philip Morris, divested RJR's international tobacco business, and brought the company right back where it started from, a U.S. tobacco company based in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Kohlberg Kravis exited RJR soon thereafter, with humble returns. But even as Wall Street's gunslingers of the 1980s drifted off into the sunset, they ushered in the dawn of the even wilder decade of the 90s. The CEOs of America, at first shocked and horrified by the barbarians at their gates, ultimately emulated them. They learned from RJR what fabulous riches were there for the taking. They began to press for their piece of the action. CEOs learned two things from LBOs, says Dick Beatty, who remained in the midst of major deals through the 90s. First, the way to build significant wealth was through equity ownership, not salary and bonuses. And second, you didn't need to do any LBO to build equity. You could give yourself stock options. With that currency, the CEOs of the 90s reaped sums to make even Ross Johnson blush, and make greed as commonplace on Main Street as Wall Street. That grasping spirit extended even to once staid accounting firms, which became more like croupiers than auditors. It was the investment bankers, growls Paul Volcker, the former Fed chairman who made a failed effort to rescue scandal-plagued Arthur Andersen. By the time he arrived in early 2002, the big swinging dicks of Wall Street had thoroughly infected the green eyeshade crowd. Recounts Volcker, the accountants felt like, we're as good as they are, and we're doing all the work. The general atmosphere was, money is out there for the taking. Call it the triumph of the barbarians, and chalk it up as one good reason this book remains relevant. The infamous CEOs of today, like Dennis Kozlowski and Bernie Ebbers, are really Ross Johnson's modern equivalents. They evolved what he pioneered, the CEO as self-interested, no-company man, the CEO as daring swashbuckler and bold expropriator of corporate assets. They merely operated on a far grander scale, for in the bull market and tech bubble of the 90s, the stakes and bucks were so much greater. Even nobodies like Henry Samueli and Henry Nicholas, co-chairman of a company called Broadcom, reaped $800 million apiece, cashing out stock in their company while telecom was still hot. Compared to that, Ross Johnson's once outrageous $53 million golden parachute is parsimonious. But even if the events in Barbarians have now been surpassed in terms of dollars, it remains unmatched for dramatics. And not because of the skills of the authors, Lord knows. It's because for those 6 weeks in 1988, when a new set of business barons vied to own a huge company and to be top dog on Wall Street, the planets were so perfectly aligned. The zeitgeist of an age was on full display in the war for RJR. Raw emotions and colliding egos, improbable plot twists, and even more improbable characters. Other authors have done masterful jobs with business sagas. David McClintock's Indecent Exposure is the template for us all, but none have been so blessed with raw materials. We had investment bankers wolfing down milk bones and sprinting through midtown Manhattan, bearing last-minute bids. We had a CEO whose dog raided a corporate jet, and whose life motto was, "A few $1 million are lost in the sands of time." We are forever grateful to them all. You couldn't make this stuff up.